cover of Weldon's Fancy Dress magazine, how varied and colourful fancy dress costumes of the 20s and early 30s in this case are. We've got the modern Cupid with yellow wings and fancy headdress, an elegant noblewoman, and a very fetching pantomime prince. And then look at the variety here. We have a Jack-in-the-Box, which of course was once a very common children's toy that some of you might remember. It was a little box and you opened the lid and a Jack-in-the-Box would ping out. And then next on the centre top we have the wonderful Moulin Rouge can dancer with a windmill headdress, of course at the Windmill Theatre where the shows featuring these can dancers was performed. And then top right we have a really interesting costume. It's called the Birdcage, and you can see that her skirt is created to look like the bars of a golden cage with a parrot inside and a parrot on her bodice, and then her headdress is gold and actually looks like the top of a bird cage. And then glossing over the less politically okay these days costume, we go on to the Kate Greenaway girl. And of course, I absolutely love those Kate Greenaway illustrations, children's book illustrations, a great passion of mine actually. And I love this Kate Greenaway costume, which would be wonderful today too. And then next to her, the Queen of Sheba. And then we move on to original costumes for the merry land of fancy dress. We've got another pantomime prince, and very popular in the 20s, the Pierrot costumes. These are described as French Pierrot for a couple to wear, her in the classic checkerboard pattern trousers and him in spots, but both with the big ruffled collars and close black fitted headdresses. And then we have a costume for a man, a sort of blue devil with his fork and his headdress with horns and his jacket with that pointed jagged hem, and below what they describe as an antique Eastern dress. And a Spanish dancer. And then we have, I guess, a Moroccan costume that they describe as carpet seller. A jockey, she's rather fancy, isn't she? In her, I like her different coloured socks and checkerboard costume and her striped jockey hat. And then a wonderful costume far right for what they call the busy bee. That's rather fabulous, isn't it? With the short black pantaloons and the stripy yellow and black vest, and then the headdress with those wonderful curly antennae. And then along the lower page, a traditional Dutch girl costume, what they call the League of Empire. Of course, that was considered very patriotic then. And I love the Cape Gooseberry. This reminds me of, if you know, the Flower Fairy illustrations by Cicely Mary Barker. I think that is rather wonderful and very sort of easy to make. She's wearing a kind of ballooning romper in Cape Gooseberry orange with a slightly acorny pointy headdress to look like the top of the Cape Gooseberry. And then, of course, green tights and green shoes to complete the Cape Gooseberry look. Then the Arabian dancer, and next the wonderful Harlequin, sort of similar to a Pierrot, but of course in the very colourful checkerboard costume with tiered collar in different colours. And then next to the Harlequin, we have Le Fetiche, and I need to look up what that is. She looks like a sort of caterpillar with a fancy skirt to me. I'm sure that's not what she's supposed to look like. Maybe it is. Some kind of bug is my guess. So I'm going to look it up, and I'll put a little note up on screen. Shows what my French is like. I do, however, recognise Le Papillon, which of course is a butterfly, and isn't that a beautiful butterfly costume with her stripy body and her pleated skirt with just the butterfly wings attached under the arms. That would be a lovely costume idea for today. And then next to her, a very pretty costume based on a Spaghetti Watteau. So I would say based on works by the painter Watteau. And of course, that's a lovely idea to take a favourite artist and base a fancy dress costume on one of their paintings. And then next to her, we have Modern Eve. So I guess a rather sort of modernist costume with this rather glorious tunic top with the fancy panels at the hips and the top hat. And then isn't the top left fun? It's Chelsea China. There was absolutely no limit to what subject you could base your fancy dress costume on. So really fun to base it on painted china. And then a canary, instantly recognisable as a canary with yellow wings, and then the little yellow cap with its yellow beak and yellow bloomers, and of course yellow tights or stockings. And then top right, a dash of Scotch, so a costume based on the popular Scottish tartan look. And then lower right, we have a Persian costume, a costume that calls itself Beck and Call, but of course I think they mean what they call bellboys. You know, those boys that ran around hotels doing everybody's bidding. One of those. He's got Beck and Call written on his jacket. And then we have next to that baby for those who wanted to dress as a baby. And costume ideas could be pretty abstract. So here we have Brighter London, and I don't know why London is shown in a yellow dress with a little black skirt or shorts underneath and a wonderful yellow ruff with a tiny little sort of doll's top hat perched on top. I mean, and she's carrying balloons, of course. I mean, a fun costume. And then next to her, even more sort of abstract thinking, Yale, who of course make the keys, and this is called Yale Blues. So she's taken keys as her theme, but isn't it an eye-catching costume? And of course, on top of her head, she wears a headdress that sort of looks like the top of a key, and she's got sort of flouncy sleeves to imitate the little pointy bits on keys. So it really shows the imagination that went into these costumes. And then a glorious got a pierrette next door with the wonderful contrasting colours, lovely pointy cap with the pom-poms and ruffle collar. She's very pretty, isn't she? And then we have the Persian ballet, which looks kind of rather like those Poiret Ballet Russe costumes, and the noblewoman and a cabaret girl. I think the cabaret girl's fun with her colourful, rather harlequin-like costume, again with a pointed hat and lots of pom-poms and colourful checkerboard cuffs too. And then on top left, we have another costume taking inspiration from painting. So we've got a lady in a fancy skirt holding an ostrich feather fan. And she, of course, is based on paintings of Goya. And then we have some Oriental inspired designs and a Pierrette modern, it says. So there she is in her yellow dress with fancy green thrilled neckline and frilly pockets, and part of a couple with a Pierrot modern. And then wonderfully top left, we have a devilish affair, and there she is in her red bloomers, sort of romper suit really, in red of course, with her little black cape and her curly black headdress, and Nell Gwyn with her orange hair, and then nautical, a little design based on a sailor costume. And then underneath we have a 17th century historical style and another figure from Watteau inspired by the paintings. And then look at the red and yellow girl, the Pied Piper. Isn't that a wonderful costume? Medieval inspired, of course, with the different coloured legs and the pointed slouch hat and the sort of vast draping sleeves. And then a costume inspired by the sea. We've got Orpheus top left, Darby and Joan, who were popular figures of the time, Russian inspired dress. And look at the rose seller, isn't she pretty? And wonderfully cottagecore with her pink skirt and her overdress with a rose print and then a little apron on top and her billowy sleeves. And then we have an odalisque and Helen of Troy of ancient Greece. And moving on to the black and white illustrations, we have a golden butterfly, and isn't that a kind of gorgeous costume? That would be wonderful today. And notice her headdress too, with the curly antennae, and those harem pants and sort of 20s simple bodice would be really easy to make. And then just a butterfly shaped and fabric just attached to her wrists, so that when she opens her arms, she's got this sort of beautiful butterfly effect. And look at Felix. This is a costume for a man with a kind of black cat Felix costume. And then we have a medieval page and a blue courtier, which they say is for a lady, for a harlequin. And look at the lily. Isn't she pretty with her floral, her bellflower headdress and her sort of bellflower skirts? She reminds me too of the Flower Fairy books. And then through a clown. And look at the ones from the lower right. There's a powder puff. I mean, isn't that fun? She's got a bow on her head. You know, the sort of bows that those powder puffs had at the time. And a kind of fluffy skirt. So it's rather wonderful, the powder puff. And then frivolity, because at this time you could just create a costume based on an idea, a concept. You can see how her dress kind of mimics the top of an umbrella, and then form in her little pointy shoes, sort of form the bottom of the umbrella. And her headdress is like the top of an umbrella. And then next to her, it's sort of like the key design really. It doesn't sound like a good idea, but you see it, and the signage is really fun. It's called Modern License, and it says wireless license, dog license. So it shows how you could create a costume on just about any idea really, and it could be really eye-catching. And then another red devil, more Pierrots, and a Robin Hood. And we can see how popular these harlequins and pierrots and historical figures were. I particularly love the concept of the sea. There she is with her bodice based on the shape of a shell, and look at her headdress, which is like a curly shell, and then she's got sort of tendrils of like seaweedy type fabric draped around her waist, and kind of fluty sleeves like a sort of jellyfish or fish fins. And here I especially love the concept of the couple who've come as night and day, and her with her wonderful moon and stars dress, and him in with his rays of the sun. And look at the girl with the matchbox hat, no more strike. So based on a box of matches, but isn't that fun? And then through a jockey, and then through to a couple who have taken the idea of parcel post, and I imagine their costumes were the colour of brown wrapping paper, and then with stickers on them saying parcel post and sort of tied up with string. I do think that's fun. Girl top left with a question mark is the masquerader, and then of course a lot of costumes based on playing cards, which are always a very striking costume idea. And just drawing your attention here to the rival blues, which of course we're talking about rowing, and there are a couple who've based their costume on rowing with the wonderful crossover oars and presumably the colours of their rowing team. Here I'd like to draw your attention to the community singing. Isn't she fun with her musical notes and her scores? And I do think musical notes are a very sort of fun print. The pillar box, look at her hat just there in the centre, and above we have a wasp, and look at the spidery dress. It's called cobweb. I mean, I especially think her cobweb headdress is a thing to behold, and like many of the costume scenes, she has a sort of spider's web in this case, but a length of cobwebby fabric attached to her wrist.